If Stephen Mather was the hype man, the marketing guru that put the National Park Service on the map, then Horace Albright was the boy genius, the guy working behind the scenes to make the whole thing happen. He was like Sam to Mather's Frodo. Sure, Frodo was carrying the ring and catching all the headlines, but Sam, he was the heart and soul of the whole effort, the one who always had Frodo's back, who stuck with him to the end, who saved him from Shelob and rescued him from the orcs and carried him up the slopes of Mount Doom and fought off Gollum. He made that promise and he intended to keep it. I mean, he got in that boat even though he couldn't swim. Like, that's dedication. A brilliant hobbit, that Samwise Gamgee. Sorry, yeah, got a little carried away there, but this is still a national parks channel, and my tangential comparisons aside, we are still talking about national parks today. We're talking about the boy genius who was one half of the brilliant duo that gave us the National Park Service we have today. We're talking about Horace Albright. Although Middle-earth would totally have some dope national parks, that might be a topic for another time. My name is Cameron. This is National Park Diaries. Welcome to episode 2 of Park Profiles, a series where I teach you about some of the most seminal figures in national park and conservation history. This channel is all about national parks, protected areas, and public lands. So if you're interested in any of those things, or somehow hearing me ramble on about Lord of the Rings, do consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the little bell thing. It really does help me bring more stories like these to more people. If you are interested in supporting me more directly, I do have a Patreon as well, where you can get some really great perks for as low as like $2 per month. My Patreon support is quite literally the thing that keeps this channel going. So much love to all my patrons. And if you want to help support that, you can check me out at patreon.com/nationalparkdiaries to learn more. Now, Horace Albright. Yes, he was the right-hand man to Stephen Mather, who we covered on the first episode of Park Profiles. Be sure to check that out if you haven't already, because these guys really are two sides of the same coin, both completely indispensable to the creation of the Park Service, even if both had totally different skill sets and did things in different ways. Mather, as we learned last time, was the brilliant marketer and promoter, doing the heavy lifting of legitimizing the Park Service and selling the idea in the eyes of the public. But Albright, while not as flashy in his approach, was just as vital. He was the guy doing the work behind the scenes, writing memos and legal documents, talking to politicians, carrying out administrative tasks, and doing paperwork. All the stuff that is crucial to any successful organization, but isn't always that glamorous. Together, these two men formed the perfect partnership to get our beloved National Park Service off the ground. But let's start at the beginning. Like Mather, Albright was also a Californian. He was born in 1890 in Bishop, California, which actually made him 23 years Mather's junior. And again, like Mather, he went to UC Berkeley, graduating in 1912. From there, he moved to Washington, D.C., where he got his start at the Interior Department as a clerk to Secretary of the Interior Franklin K. Lane. While working this job, Albright actually attended Georgetown University at night to earn his law degree, which would certainly come in handy for the task that was about to come his way. See, Albright's work at Interior up to that point included some park issues, but it wasn't his entire job. The park issues would come later when, in 1915, the one and only Stephen Mather joined the Interior Department. Mather was actually hesitant to even accept this position. He was seriously doubtful of his own ability to do government work. He was convinced that it just wasn't his cup of tea. But Franklin Lane, the Interior Secretary, convinced him to take the job. He said, quote, "I'll give you a young fellow who knows the ropes and who will handle the legal and other troubles you'll run into. He's the man to keep you out of trouble. Someone who knows the department, can handle the routine administrative work," end quote. That young fellow was, of course, Horace Albright. And so was formed the greatest partnership in the history of the National Park Service. These two men spent the next 2 years laying the foundations and building support for, as they called it, a National Parks Bureau. Again, Mather was the marketer. He was out promoting, publicizing, all of that stuff. He was the front man. But there was Albright back in DC, crossing the I's and dotting the T's, laying the legal and administrative foundations for the future National Park Service. Their hard work paid off when, in August 1916, the National Park Service was created. And I want to take a break from the timeline here and just emphasize how complementary the relationship was between Mather and Albright. Each of them had a unique set of skills, both of which were crucial to the creation of the National Park Service. Mather understood that parks needed legitimacy and people to visit them to justify their entire existence. He used his marketing prowess to build that support. Albright knew that a brand new bureaucratic agency had to have strong legal and administrative underpinnings and used his legal background and attention to detail to build that framework. In this way, Mather and Albright were like yin and yang, peanut butter and jelly, Sam and Frodo. They were perfect complements. But the work was far from over. Even though the National Park Service was now a thing that existed, they still had to guide it through its early years, its most important years, to make sure that all the work that they had just put into it didn't go to waste. And for me, this is actually the most remarkable part of Albright's entire story. So if you'll recall from the Stephen Mather episode, he dealt with what we today would call bipolar disorder. And right after he was appointed the first director of the National Park Service, he suffered a severe bout of depression. He was hospitalized and unable to carry out his duties as director. Albright was his number 2, and so he became the acting National Park Service director in 1917. I cannot emphasize enough that he was 27 years old when this responsibility fell to him. That's basically someone my age leading the National Park Service. It's insane. And he did this at a time when this new agency, unprecedented in the history of the world, was only a few months old and needed strong and steady leadership at the most important point in its history, to see it through all the trials and tribulations it was sure to face as it got off the ground. And the US would go on to enter World War I not long after he took over, meaning he had to deal with all the constraints that a country at war placed him under. This included things like budget cuts, but there was also this incident with cattle grazers who, under the guise of patriotic duty, wanted to use the national parks to help the war effort. Albright saw right through this and refused the request because he saw it for what it was, an effort to open up the national parks to commercial exploitation. He worried that if that step was taken now, they could never go back, that the can of worms would have been opened. So he put his foot down and set a precedent that the national parks were to be protected for the people, not private enterprise. It is a precedent that has lasted to this day. I love that anecdote because it shows what kind of leader Albright was. He was strong and principled and had incredible foresight into what the national parks could be. He was adamant about laying strong foundations and setting healthy precedents, cultivating an ethos of preservation and giving the parks the protection they needed in those early days to grow it into the institution they are today. Again, this was a fledgling agency, and the decisions made at that time would have a lot of bearing on how national parks ultimately came to be managed. Albright would go on to hold the acting director role for 2 years before Mather came back to resume his duties in 1919. But again, Albright's work was far from done. Although he did almost quit the National Park Service at this time, he had a kid on the way and needed something more stable for his family. Traveling all the time and never being home wasn't really conducive to a great family life. but he did love the National Park Service. So once Mather returned to the director's chair, he and Albright came up with the perfect position for him, one that would allow him a stable family life in a single location while still being of service to the national parks he loved. He would go and serve as the first ever NPS superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, a post he would hold for nearly a decade. In this role, Albright once again showcased his leadership qualities. I mean, this was America's flagship national park, and he was the first person from the National Park Service to lead it. It was not lost on him the significance of this moment in history. He was determined to set a proper example of national park management for the future. And indeed, he set in motion several policies which still exist to this day. For one, he hired some of the first ranger naturalists, what we would today call interpretive rangers. This was part of a philosophy that Albright had about interpreting the scenery and surroundings of these parks. Remember that with the marketing push, a lot more people are coming to visit the parks, Yellowstone being a big one. Albright didn't want them to just come and see these places. He wanted them to come and learn and understand them. The interpretive rangers were the living embodiment of that philosophy, one which continues strongly to this day. He established several park museums for this same reason. Also, he was behind some of the first ever architecture and design standards for national parks, that classic rustic style which was designed to blend in with the natural environment. During the same time he was superintendent of Yellowstone, he also served as a field director for the National Park Service. I mean, this guy was just a prolific worker, so during the off-season, he was out inspecting new places for inclusion in the National Park Service. He was heavily involved with the creation of Grand Teton National Park and the movement to bring national parks to the east via Great Smoky Mountains and Shenandoah National Parks. And then, in 1929, Albright once again returned to the director's chair. Stephen Mather, Albright's dear friend and mentor, had had a stroke, and the Park Service was in need of leadership. Taking the reins one last time, Albright proceeded to have perhaps his biggest impact of all on the national park system. See, Albright was an ardent student of history, and it was his belief that the National Park Service should preserve not only America's natural history, but its cultural history as well. He convinced President Franklin Roosevelt of this need, after which, in 1933, 57 new national park units were transferred from the Departments of Agriculture and War, encompassing all manner of military, historic, and cultural resources. This reorganization solidified the National Park Service's role in historic preservation, which it, again, maintains to this day. Today's national battlefields, military parks, historic sites, and historical parks are the direct beneficiaries of Albright's legendary foresight. Having achieved everything he set out to accomplish at this point, Horace Albright retired from the National Park Service in 1933, just 43 years old. He would go on to become the president of the United States Potash Company until 1956. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor, in 1980 and died in Van Nuys, California in 1987. He will go down, along with Mather, as one of the seminal figures in national park history and a personal hero of mine. I see a lot of myself in Horace Albright, someone who's not a great marketer, as you can probably tell, but is willing to work behind the scenes to get things done for the things they care about, who's a passionate and ardent student of history and the natural world, and who values the power of education and interpretation in helping to protect our nation's beautiful places. It's people like Albright who inspired the next generation of conservation leaders and professionals, who inspired me, and whose teachings and lessons and philosophies I try to impart to you through these videos. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Park Profiles and can now appreciate everything Horace Albright has done for these places we so love and which I've dedicated an entire YouTube channel to. Be sure to leave your thoughts on Horace Albright in the comments down below. And if you have anyone you'd like to see covered on this series, do leave that as well. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the little bell thing so you don't miss an episode. Check out my Patreon and follow me on Instagram for channel updates and park adventures. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.